class-related society. Platypus has chapters in South Korea, Greece, Austria, Germany, England, Canada, and the United States. We host public fora on the history and theory of the left and how it bears upon the present. So please check us out at platypus1917.org if you haven't already. So I'd like to thank our panelists for being here today. I'm going to read a few introductory remarks, and then each of the panelists will have 10 to 12 minutes to give some opening remarks. And then after that, we'll open up the floor for questions. And when you ask questions, please try to keep them fairly brief. Try to ask one question or emphasize one main point, and then we'll all have a chance to have a discussion. So, so this panel is motivated in part by the anticipation of deja vu. Summit-hopping activists will soon arrive by the busload, armed with concepts like neoliberalism, alter-globalization, imperialism, and the global elite. Talk of a state of exception may be used among academics to describe the city's unprecedented and legally sanctioned repressive measures. Referring to the relocation of the G8 summit to Camp David, some have already claimed that the prospect of mass protest and direct action has forced the hand of the global 1%. In other words, although progressive social transformation now appears to be no closer, the left is already counting its supposed victories. With slight alterations, I could be describing Toronto in 2010, Genoa in 2001, Seattle in 1999, and so on. Considering the scale of resistance and the likelihood of a police riot, the coming months have even been compared to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. It is obvious that the ideology of today's protesters has not been inherited primarily from the 1960s left, but rather from the left of the 1990s and 2000s. If this is true, what separates Chicago 2012 from Genoa 2001 or Seattle 1999? Many would reply, the Occupy movement. Indeed, the renewal of confidence on the left has inspired the term Chicago Spring to describe the coming months of political activity. Some hope or fear that large-scale resistance to the G8 and NATO will breathe new life into the Occupy movement. Others believe that the Occupy movement's spring renewal will breathe new life into anti-G8 and anti-NATO resistance. Whatever the political stakes of the Chicago Spring, many of the most serious occupiers recognize the need to draw all possible lessons from the left's victories and defeats over the past 2 decades. To this end, I've asked our panelists to address 4 sets of questions. First, what's wrong with the G8 and NATO? On what grounds should the G8 and NATO be politicized? To what extent is social domination reducible to, or expressed by, the G8 and NATO? Related to this, how should we understand and unpack concepts like the global elite, global rulers, and the global 1%? How do these ways of describing social domination relate to Marxist understandings of capital and of capitalism? Should we think of the G8 and NATO as symptoms of a larger problem, or as the problems themselves? Second, if the G8 and NATO perpetuate a global status quo, what would a world without these institutions look like? Although the idea of alter-globalization has achieved a wide consensus on the left, and this contrasts media stereotypes of some protesters as opposing globalization from a uniformly reactionary or primitive perspective, it remains the case that the left politicizes the G8 from a diversity of ideological commitments. Likewise, some on the left have lent qualified support to NATO interventions in the Balkans and Afghanistan on anti-fascist or humanitarian grounds, but most have staunchly opposed all NATO actions on anti-imperialist grounds. Perhaps the question should be productively posed as follows. Would global bodies function in an emancipated world? And if so, how? Third, how do you assess the necessity and efficacy of activist resistance to the G8 and NATO? How would a local repeat of the Battle of Seattle advance the cause of human emancipation? Or, as David Graeber once put it, what would it mean to win? And finally, what is the relationship between the Occupy movement and the anti-G8 and anti-NATO protests? If Occupy adopts the alter-globalization model of regular summit confrontations, Would this shift indicate progress or regress compared to last fall's strategy of uninterrupted public occupations? What are the political stakes of the Chicago Spring? With these questions in mind, we will now hear from John Sargis, Fred Mecklenburg, and Bernard Harcourt, in that order. John Sargis is a political activist and organizer in Paterson, New Jersey. He is also the assistant editor of the International Journal of Inclusive Democracy. He is a contributor to the book Globalized Capitalism, The Eclipse of the Left, and Inclusive Democracy. He taught high school biology in Paterson, New Jersey for 26 years, and he also functioned as a union leader. Fred Mecklenburg has been a revolutionary activist since 1989. In a landscape of capitalist decay, racism, and war, he has tried to remain true to the idea of freedom he learned from Marx, Hegel, and Dostoevsky, as well as the mass struggles which give that idea its life. Most recently, he has been active in support of the Syrian Revolution. Bernard Harcourt is the Julius Krieger Professor of Law and Professor and Chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's the author most recently of The Illusion of Free Markets, Punishment and the Myth of Natural Order. Bernard has written about Occupy Wall Street for the New York Times and The Guardian. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists once again for being here today, and we'll hear from John first.
Thank you, Ed. I want to thank the Platypus Society for inviting me here today, and I'm glad you're all here to make that. This is very important now that we start overturning the status quo, not only nationally but internationally. So today I want to lay out the inclusive democracy, or I'll say ID, perspective on rulers, domination, and emancipation, and hopefully take care of Ed's quite complex questions. Okay? So I want to lay out this perspective as it, I'm going to read some of this, or most of it, because it's quite complex and we have to make some distinctions that maybe some of us haven't discovered. So I want to lay this out as it relates to our opposition to the G8 and NATO and other organizations of the transnational elite, euphemistically called the world community or the family of nations, in order to clarify the problems and issues involved in remaking society and why and how the ID project is a viable, emancipatory, anti-systemic alternative to this system of the market economy and representative democracy, which is really the cause of the multidimensional crisis we face, of political, economic, social, ecological, of which the G8, NATO, ISAF, IMF, EU, you name it, World Bank, NAFTA, are the institutions that represent the political and economic interests of the transnational elite. But first we have to remember that it is neither bad nor evil members of the transnational elite who own and operate transnational corporations who are the cause of globalization and the subsequent economic crisis, nor that the cause is corrupt or greedy capitalists, banksters, gamers, etc. And second, it is mythically assumed that if we sweep aside these bad, greedy, and corrupt corporatists, there will be a capitalism we can live with, one with a human face. However, the transnational elite is only an effect of the process of market globalization. The dynamics of the global market economy and its political complement representative democracy have produced the emergence of transnational corporations and of a transnational economic elite who have institutionalized the present international market economy and neoliberal form of modernity with their institutions, the G8, NATO, EU, NAFTA, etc. So, who are these transnational elite? We may define them as the elite which draws its power, economic, political, or generally social power, by operating at the transnational level, a fact which implies that it does not express solely or even primarily the interests of a particular nation state or imperialist empire. The transnational elite consists of the transnational economic elites, transnational corporation executives and their local affiliates, which play a dominant role in the ruling elite of the internationalized market economy. Second, the transnational political elites, that is the globalizing bureaucrats, who will be here soon, and politicians, who may be based either in major international organizations or in the state machines of the major market economies. And third, the transnational professional elites, whose members play a dominant role in the various international foundations, think tanks, research departments of major universities, the mass media, etc. So, the members of the transnational elite see that the best way to secure their privileged position in society is not by ensuring the reproduction of any real or imagined nation state, but instead by securing the worldwide reproduction of the system of the market economy and representative democracy. One of the fake reasons Bush went into Iraq was that he was going to bring the market and democracy to them as the best and only way to attain prosperity, happiness, and peace. The transnational elite has institutionalized its role through these institutions, IMF, World Bank, etc., with its immediate aim to pull down all regulatory barriers impeding the free exchange of goods and services which are being forced on the rest of the world. The ultimate aim is the formation of a vast, single, deregulated market controlled by multinational companies, in which social controls over markets to protect labor or the environment are minimized. Furthermore, the transnational elite relies on its political globalization, which include the persistent importance of national identities, despite or because of cultural homogenization forced by globalization, in order to keep the semblance of a well-functioning representative democracy in which local elites are supposedly still capable of making effective decisions, which we know is a farce. Also, the need to provide increasingly meager safety nets organized by the state, to provide minimal social services, we see this happening everywhere, to the poor, and the need to delegate the nation states a significant amount of the monopoly of violence so that they are capable of controlling the population and the movement of labor in a way that maximizes the benefits to the transnational elite from the free flow of capital and commodities. So the transnational economic elite controls the internationalized market economy. The transnational political elites control the political military dimension of the, we call it the New World Order. And the transnational professional elites provide the ideological framework for the rationalization of the market economy and representative democracy as the main institutions which secure the concentration of economic and political power into their hands. Okay? That's the main function of these institutions, to concentrate power into the elite so that they can keep their privileged position and not share it with anyone. The ID Project is opposed to these institutions of the international elite because ID is both an anti-systemic project and also a project of social self-institution for individual and social autonomy, establishing the equal distribution of power across the political, economic, social, and ecological spheres. The ID Project has nothing to do with the myth of equality as we see in representative democracy. The Democrats and Republicans have alternately ruled the US for over 150 years, keeping hierarchy intact. Contrarily, ID is direct democracy where power is shared among all citizens equally. But in the past, some of these panels and discussions, it seemed like some folks were kind of confused on what anti-systemic meant or just opposed to the system. So what do we mean by an anti-systemic project? An anti-systemic movement is distinguished from other social movements because it explicitly challenges the legitimacy of a socio-economic system, both in the sense of its institutions, which create and reproduce the unequal distribution of power, and the value system which legitimizes the domination of human over human and society over nature. In this sense, an anti-systemic movement differs from a reformist movement because anti-systemic movement aims at the replacement of the main socioeconomic institutions and values with new institutions and values, which would be democratically organized. And the latter aims at simply reforming the existing institutions, deepening democracy, better regulating the market economy, but keeping the system intact, basically, but putting a human face on it. Thus, ID is a revolutionary movement aiming at a radical rupture of the system. Social movements have to have an organization at the grassroots level that goes beyond the spontaneous protests or gatherings of people with similar ideas and values. And as organizers, we know how very difficult this is nowadays to organize on the local level. People don't have the time, they're working 3 jobs, they have families, and they just can't sit down and think about their condition much, even though they feel very much oppressed and beaten down. They go from ghetto jobs to ghetto education to ghetto hospitals to ghetto housing. But they still don't have the, they're not provoked enough to be able to start questioning the system. Okay, so they have to have so social movements have to have a common outlook and set of values and a rationale for them. Inclusive democracy offers such a reorganization of society based on the conditions set up by the citizens themselves, not by some hierarchical group somewhere coming out with statements. Thus, ideas founded on a self-reflective choice and on creating institutions which secure the equal sharing of political, economic, social, and ecological power. Now I shall briefly attempt to demystify the causes of the Arab revolutions, or what has been called the Arab Spring, in light of the fact that these new means to obtain the same ends. These are new means to obtain the same ends. The ultimate aim in all the cases of the Arab revolutions has been to secure the full integration of all Arab regimes, North Africa and Iran, into the New World Order. In other words, the order and the universalization through neoliberal globalization of the system of the market economy and representative democracy, as well as its ideological complement, which we just saw happen in Libya, justifying the need for the drastic restriction, if not abolition, of national sovereignty under the pretext of protecting human rights, the right to protect. All administered by the economic, political, and cultural elites that constitute the transnational elite. We see this with the UN, and NATO came in and started everything. In Libya, that is. However, what the most significant unifying element in all these cases is not so much the ultimate aim of the transnational elite, which has always been the same, but the means used to achieve it. Either through a pseudo-democratization of existing client regimes, got it, yeah, Tunisia and Egypt, or through armed insurrections leading to pre-planned regime change, Libya and Syria. If you recall, George Bush II laid out the axis of evil, and Syria was one of them, right? And I believe, was it? Syria, Iran, and...
it was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. That's right. So Iran's next on the list. Okay. Or finally, through a combination of a pink revolution followed by some sort of military strike, siege, or even war against Iran, which is becoming a pariah state. The Arab Spring, which we'll talk about that later if we have anything. But the Arab Spring has been completely distorted by the world mass media and unprecedented manipulation of world public opinion, which was a psyops media war launched on the occasion of the Iraq invasion. Thus, with respect to Libya and Syria, we have a complete manipulation of world public opinion by the world mass media, which almost unanimously have distorted not just the real aims and ultimate causes of the military campaigns, but sometimes have even engineered the facts themselves. Okay. ID does not accept uncritically the Arab revolutions, but in our analysis makes the necessary distinctions between them. And if you like, I don't have time now to get into them, but there are very fine distinctions that should be made. I guess I could finish that now, but finally, the next few months will show whether the replacement of the Islamic regime in Iran by a combination of air campaign or some sort of pink revolution will be the culmination of this huge campaign to fully integrate all non-client Arab regimes and North Africa into the New World Order, or instead of a stepping stone to the creating a world government, which we can see happening now because the EU appointed a technocrat to become the Prime Minister of Greece, if you recall. Georgaki Papandreou stepped aside, and they just placed a technocrat in this place. There's no voting or anything, so we have to be very careful.
Same in Italy.
Same in Italy also. It was technocrat.
Great, thanks, John. I want to thank you for keeping your remarks brief. We started a little late, so this will ensure we have some time for question and answer. Also, if you want to pass these down yourselves.
Good. Oh, I need that.
Okay, this will be both a discussion and somewhat of a cautionary tale, I think. I'll try to speak to all of the points that you asked about. To begin with, what's wrong with G8 and NATO, and on what grounds should that be politicized? Well, what's wrong with G8 and NATO is that it is a representative of the world capitalist order and the very texture of life under that order should tell you what's wrong with it. If you're lucky enough to have a home at this point, you may be watching a home crumble down around you while you don't have enough money to pay the bills that keep coming like the voice of doom at your door, maybe more and more every month. You don't have the money to pay the health costs for your sick parents who may or may not be lucky enough to have union pensions. You probably don't. Your kids won't. You may or may not be able to take care of your kids in that way. And if your misery that you're feeling threatens to spill out onto the streets, immediately the police will appear and point guns at you, and you'll be threatened with the prison system, the abyss of the prison system, and you're also threatened with the abyss of homelessness. All of these things have become the standard issue life that we're given. In other words, capitalism is in the process of reducing us to nothing but a word in its language. It's reducing your humanity to a word in the language of capital, a hieroglyphic that suffers. And this is why the Arab Spring began with Mohammed Bouazizi and Hussein Felhi erasing themselves. And this is why the negation of that erasure was a diamond-hard demand for human dignity that you saw rise across the Middle East spontaneously. At the same time, that demand for human dignity was arising in the United States here, in the Georgia prison system, where a hunger strike adopted the slogan of the labor movement, an injury to one is an injury to all, and became the biggest labor action in Georgia in decades. This demand for dignity has been the story of the Arab Spring, the prison revolts, to an extent of Wisconsin, and as Mark pointed out in the panel before us, it's the story of Occupy, which gave people a voice to say these things, which they have nowhere else in this society at this point, certainly not in the media. And personally, in terms of what that means for G8 and NATO, yeah, I'm one of the people who's bitter about the life that we've been given. And I wouldn't mind seeing these representatives of the ruling class humiliated and having to eat off the floor of hell for a little while, like we've had to. But by the same token, the logic of capitalism is not, as the question asks, co-equal with NATO and the G8. It's not reducible to G8 and NATO. Capitalism is a larger phenomenon in the world. It's more pervasive. Consider only the relationship between the United States and China at this point. It's a vast, really awe-inspiring example of the concentration and the centralization of capital. It's reminiscent almost, and it's never talked about. And number one, because it cuts across the kind of bullshit ideological barriers that are thrown up, so-called communism versus, which is only state capitalism, and our state capitalism, which is so-called democracy. But it's a structure that's so large that it's like the clusters of galaxies. We haven't even gotten used to thinking about it yet. We haven't gotten acclimated that things of that size can exist. And I think it's only now that we realize that we can begin to communicate with the working class of China and organize against it. And that's going to be a new phenomenon, something that we haven't seen before. Nevertheless, some, including very, very much myself, saw the NATO and G8 meetings in Chicago, and of course now we know G8's not actually coming because they're going to do it behind closed doors. But we saw this as a chance to place a direct critique of capitalism as a world system on the agenda. Not least because of Chicago's association with things like the struggle for the 8-hour day, as well as the founding of the Industrial Workers of the World, the African Blood Brotherhood, Fred Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition, a great history of rebellion and revolutionism in this city. And in essence, it was a chance to bring together the specific and the general in a time of world upheaval, the time of the Arab Spring, the occupations in Europe, etc. And it's maybe something similar to the experience of the Battle of Seattle. If that battle had been explicitly waged in a context of things like the IWW free speech fights, the Seattle General Strike, the Russian Revolution, and the letter of Lenin to American labor, I think some of us saw NATO and G8 as a possibility to do a more explicit version of something like that. possibly even making a statement akin to the founding of the first International Working Men's Association. That was my own dream about it. And really what that amounts to is a chance to bring history together with the philosophy of history, of Marxism, in a very concrete way that was, you know, it was both empirically there and it was philosophically there, you know, sort of like the last paragraph of Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, if you will. So what blew up this vision for me was apparent at the first large meeting to organize at the Kent College of Law to organize against NATO and the G8, when one of the last speakers got up and went into, he's from Answer, the Answer Coalition, and went into paeans of praise for Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Not just criticizing the NATO intervention, which could certainly be criticized, and it was certainly directed to maximize imperialist leverage over the Arab Spring and the Middle East revolutions, but actually that Gaddafi was some sort of a valid alternative. This eccentric police state ruler who had deeply collaborated with imperialism on every level, practiced all kinds of tortures against his own people, had decades, 4 decades in power to create a decent society and did nothing but abscond with the oil money. So it was clear to me that wasn't going to work, but I still wanted to work, you know, for it. What really became a problem was when some of the same forces decided that they were going to support Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which there is nothing, and even in that case, NATO intervention is non-existent. There's been no NATO intervention, right? I mean, tell me if you've seen it, but I haven't seen it. And nobody has seen it. Nobody in Syria has seen it, you know. Nobody in Syria is getting guns from NATO. So I'm still hopeful, you know, in the history in its desultory way will produce something of this, you know, largely through Occupy, hopefully, and the kind of meetings and forums that are plannable around that. But, you know, it really, I think, is a cautionary tale of something that was a missed opportunity, and I was pretty disappointed in that, and I'm not gonna airbrush that over. I want to address this question of what would a world without NATO and the G8 look like, because obviously it should be clear I'm a Marxist humanist, I'm a Marxist. So my idea of a world without oppression is a world from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her means. Concretely, what would that mean? It would mean a world of consciously, freely associated human beings practicing that slogan, from each according to his or her ability, to each according to his or her needs. And concretely, that would mean that when I look at a place like Daraa, or Idlib, or Baba Amra, I wouldn't have to rage at the massacre and the genocide that's happening there now. I wouldn't have to do that. I'd be able to just look over there and say, hey, how are you guys doing? What can I do for you? You need anything? No, I'm straight. Thank you for the figs, though. You know, something as simple as being able to casually be human with other human beings. That's what a post-capitalist society is about. Will that be hard to obtain? Yes, every experience that I've ever had of history as it exists tells me that will be brutally hard to obtain, including the experience of organizing against NATO and the G8. Is that impossible to attain, that world? No. No, it's not any more impossible to attain than the choices we make in speaking to each other about it. And I'm just going to end with that for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'll try and be brief so that we can open it up for questions and conversation. And I want to focus, I think, on the relationship between G8/NATO and the Chicago Spring. I think it's very important kind of not to misdirect critique and also not to be seduced by strategic opportunities. So not in some sense to distort one's critique based on what can be sometimes very attractive opportunities. I tended to think of the kind of Chicago G8, NATO, double summit meeting. I tended to interpret it as something as a strategic opportunity for Occupy Chicago. But I think it's important at this point, now that G8 is not coming, to kind of separate the links between the G8 and NATO, and not to continue talking about G8/NATO. So in terms of what is going to happen in May in Chicago, I think it's important in Chicago not to be thinking of it as G8/NATO anymore, but simply as there is going to be a NATO summit in Chicago. And so I think it's important to kind of separate out these different pieces, because any kind of critique of what is going to happen in May in Chicago will be correctly understood as a critique of NATO, period, and not G8/NATO. Right? In other words, the landscape has changed. So I think it's important to look first then at NATO. What does it mean to say that one wants to resist or protest or mount a critique of NATO? And here I think it's complicated. It's not entirely clear to me what it means to be opposed to a military alliance that is represented by NATO. And the reason it seems to me that it's complicated is that essentially U.S. defense spending dwarfs defense spending by other countries, dwarfs defense spending by NATO, but dwarfs other defense spending, right? So when we talk about kind of NATO, it's really as if it's kind of it's a red herring in some sense. I have a, hopefully this will work. Yeah, I have a graph here. This was from a blog I posted, I don't know, a few months ago. I don't know, it was on deficits and defense spending on balkanization, which is and this is defense spending in dollar amounts by different countries around the globe. And so you've got U.S., which stands at approximately $687 billion, which represents 4.7% of its GDP. And then, of course, you've got other countries. And what's clear from this picture here is that U.S. military spending is enormous, proportionally speaking. The U.S. spends 50%. The U.S. spending now represents 50% of the world's military spending. Of the entire, if you aggregate the world's military spending, the U.S. represents 50% of that spending. Okay. If you aggregate all other NATO members, U.S. spends 44% more than aggregated NATO members, right? So you get a picture here. I had done it in a variety of different ways here. There's something strange about Saudi Arabia, which spends a ton of money on per capita. Here's per capita. Again, U.S. kind of dwarfs these other countries, most of the other countries, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, which has a large per capita, but it's an issue of like lots of spending, small population, so it's kind of it's a little bit of an anomaly. But again, you look at even per person, we're spending so much more than these other countries. So now, and also when you figure out who is in NATO, right? We're talking about countries that include Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Turkey. So, I don't know what it would. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that it's a sharp object of critique. NATO. I mean, when I look at the list of these countries, I wonder actually if maybe the United States is actually providing a service to these countries because maybe they're spending less on their military defense and able to spend more on social programs in part because we seem to be doing the world's military spending. So in any event, on that first question of kind of like, what does it mean to go after NATO? It strikes me that it's that we've got a domestic issue in the United States that needs to be addressed, and to me, NATO is really a sideshow. Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, it means to me that I'm not sure that it would be strategically smart to be kind of affiliated in a kind of I'm opposed to NATO position. Right? I mean, I think that there's something else that is more important here and has to do with U.S. defense spending. Then that leaves G8, kind of opposition to the G8 summit. But of course, G8 summit is at Camp David. So it's not really part of the Chicago. Conventionally, opposition to the G8 has been associated with, or in other words, the kind of the symbolic meaning of opposition to G8 has generally been the anti-globalization movement. And so it strikes me that kind of taking the G8 as a target, if this were for kind of the Occupy movement, would be something that the Occupy movement should think about cautiously, insofar as to date the Occupy movement hasn't embraced any particular unique ideological perspective, right? So to date it's been a relatively open to many views, and so the question becomes, does turning Occupy into an anti-G8 moment, in some sense, represent an embracing of one particular critique, which is the anti-globalization critique? Interestingly, right, the original call which was from Adbusters, I take it, was May 1, Occupy Chicago, bring your tent. Now, that was interesting in some sense because, of course, it wasn't May 17th, Occupy Chicago, bring your tent. It was May 1, right? So, and obviously there are lots of other connotations to May 1, May Day. But also, it was kind of before the summit was going to happen. So it wasn't exactly a call to have protest about the summit. It seemed as if it was a peculiar relationship to G8 NATO. It was as if, look, May 1, come to Chicago and bring your tent for an occupation that's then, by the way, going to coincide on May 17th and then May 20th with two interesting summit meetings, right? So I take it that was originally a kind of, there was a strategic symbiotic relationship there that was being, that was trying to be used, I think, in a strategic opportunity. But of course, G8 is just not going to be in Chicago, so it leaves us, I think, in a kind of position of not knowing exactly what's left of that relationship. I'll stop there, and hopefully we can open up and have a conversation about this.
Great. Well, I thought I'd begin with the first question. Namely, I'm interested in how you might have differing conceptions of the idea of a global elite, or if you find that concept even useful for the left, if you subscribe to it. For example, the very idea of a kind of summit protest seems to imply a kind of giving prominence or giving importance to an elite, whether it's the elite that sort of safeguards the global military spending system that you outlined, Bernard, or if it's the elite that is seen to defend the kind of oppressive and desperate conditions of life that you described, Fred. And of course, you addressed an idea of an elite very centrally as well, John. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that. Why do you think the left is using that as a concept? Do you think that's a good concept? How do you understand it?
I don't know. Well, as we look at it, the transnational elite has these institutions which lay out their foundations and their schemes, and they go about doing it. I mean, can you say that question again? Because I wasn't. I thought you were talking to.
Oh yeah, really, we could come back if you'd like.
Yeah.
But really, just the idea of should the left use the concept of the elite? What does it mean to you? Do you see it as problematic? What is the efficacy of it politically?
Right. Well, sure, because representative democracy and the market economy concentrates power into a few hands, and these people are the elite, and this is what has to be dismantled. That's all I can offer right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've become a really big fan of things like Forbes magazine or some of these New Yorker profiles that really do detail in great, with great accuracy what the elite is up to. And it's really fascinating to read about the elite going to some obscure island in the People's Republic of China and meeting with all the Central Committee and the Capitalists, and everybody will be together. And that kind of stuff is fascinating. And it gives you a certain healthy contempt for the people who embody it. But at the same time, I mean, those people, what they really embody is the capitalist system itself. I mean, they're representatives of capital, and I think that we should not. I don't exaggeratedly vilify them, and I think that some of the rhetoric that talks about like the banksters and things can easily fall into kind of conspiracy theorizing, and can fall very far short of a real analysis of what capitalism is in its essence. So, but like I said, I'm a huge fan of gossip about the elite.
So I'd say a couple of things. The term itself has a long history in its usage, and I think that we've seen in U.S. political discourse, I think we've seen a return to a concept of the elite, which in part as a result of the Occupy movement is, I think, the 1%, right? I mean, in other words, the 1%, which is a metaphor, right, is, I take it, a metaphor for a conception of a political and wealth elite. So I think it's a term that's kind of ebbed and flowed in its usage and whatnot, but to a certain extent might have more, is maybe being used more now, actually, as a result of the conception or the use of the term, the 1%. Which has become, I mean, if you look at newspapers and the media, I mean, the term now is being used kind of commonly. It's kind of like a term that everyone knows what the reference point is, which is, in a certain sense, you never would have heard, you hear people using the term 1% now, you never would have heard people using the term elite a year ago, I think. But the other thing that's I just want to kind of problematize one notion of the elite in relationship to the G8 again, which I think we're trying to focus on NATO and on the G8 as much as possible here, is I see. So one of the interesting things, of course, is when the G8 is here in May, it's possible that the French government that's going to be here is going to be a socialist government. So the elections, the first round is in April, the second round is in May. It'll happen before the G8. Polls, excuse me?
You mean NATO?
Before, yes, NATO, right, yeah. But all this is going to happen both before, but also before the G8 in Camp David. I mean, so in other words, the government that's going to be, the government representatives from France who are going to be attending these meetings. It's based on present polling, it looks as if it's going to be François Hollande, who is a socialist. I mean, it's the Socialist Party. Now that then raises, now, could be, a lot of people could say, well, it's not a truly socialist party, not a truly socialist government, etc. I mean, there are lots of, there are lots of possible critiques here, or whatever, but at least, and then that raises the question of how do we think of the different members of this G8 and different members of this elite when some of them then are not what you would have expected, say, right?
Questions? So, go ahead.
All right, my question is primarily for John, but I think I got one first. Do you believe that it's possible to have a national elite that's oppressive? Or do you think that the primary problem with since the global elite is its globalness, or is it really the problem that it's an elite? I think another question for the whole panel is, how do we politically understand the fact that the only thing standing between Kabul and the Taliban is the US Army today? And that calls for sort of an end to NATO intervention in the world, meaning to a very large extent, and we cannot we can't just wish away, handing over the world to the grasp of people who are not very nice people.
Okay, now, any elite, it's a hierarchical structure, and this is what we have to get rid of. Hierarchy naturally gravitates to an elite. The bottom is the rest of us in this pyramid. So whether they're local elites or part of the transnational elite and their institutions with the G8, etc., you can't have an elite, not in a democracy anyway. There's no such thing. And the thing with the Taliban and Kabul and the military, if the United States, I don't think they, actually, when we look at the history of this, the Taliban were going to hand over Osama bin Laden. And the United States says, forget that, we're not going to deal with that. And the United States, right in May of that year, had the Taliban down in Texas because they need oil pipelines going through there. And so they were working with the Taliban. They were giving them money because they eradicated poppy, whatever way they saw fit. So are we really handing over something to people we don't like? I don't know, we worked with them before, and I'm sure we could work with them again because they want the pipelines through there and they want the resources.
Well, that's a good question. So the 2012 NATO Chicago Summit meeting has as its first thing on its agenda is the alliance's commitment to Afghanistan through transition and beyond. So that's the first issue they're going to be dealing with,
Yeah, I mean, it is a very profound question, I think. And in point of fact, and it's the second time in my lifetime that it's had to be dealt with. I'm old enough to remember the Russians in Afghanistan, and I opposed the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. I was not in favor of fundamentalism, and had to ask, who in that sense do you support? And it's obviously the kind of secular, urban, women's movement type people. And we saw how they were crushed by the Taliban and when they took over. And that's not something to be dealt with lightly. At the same time, why does this situation exist? I mean, partly because U.S. soldiers are over there pissing on dead bodies, burning Korans idiotically, shooting people's dogs, trashing people's houses. And I mean, this is, not something that, you can read this in the mainstream press at this point. It's just admittedly so. And, it's very difficult. And I mean, this is the kind of question that highlights, I think, the utter tragedy, I don't even know a word for it, but the abnegation of revolutionary responsibility that's taken place by the left in this world is like incredible. And this is exactly the tragedy. No one should have ever expected George W. Bush to wage a revolutionary war of liberation. That wasn't going to happen. At every stage, the U.S. betrayed the aspirations of progressive people in Afghanistan, beginning with the women of Afghanistan. When it went to the first Loya Jirga that was held and basically told them, shut up. Your demands aren't for now. And, it's difficult. I mean, my position is I do support groups like the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, the General Women's Liberation Movement in Afghanistan. There is a labor movement in Afghanistan. There's things like the Afghan Revolutionary Labor Organization. I mean, there are things that you can point to and say, as a Marxist, as a humanist, as a decent human being, I sound like a Eustonite. I actually signed the Euston Manifesto, by the way. There are things you can point to, but yeah, it's hideously tragic at this point. And it will, like the uprising in Iraq that took place after the first Gulf War, when the people of Iraq rose up against Saddam Hussein en masse, and the U.S. Army stood there and let them be slaughtered because they preferred stability in the region, and their Syrian allies preferred stability in the region, and their Saudi allies preferred stability in the region. Okay, and it's Hama rules. It's the reality of power. The realities of power, as my CIA-sponsored history teacher used to say. And the kind of things, the movements I think that we need to promote are the ones which deal with exactly these kind of dilemmas. Because this is right now the profoundest kind of dilemma that the human race is facing. And it's why you have to have your own ground, your own revolutionary ground to stand on. You can't take the sides of one or these other oppressive forces, because then you'll never think it through. It will never happen. For there even to be a chance for these women, for these workers in Afghanistan to ever win, they need revolutionaries across the world to be working on this. And that's really, I wish I could say more concretely. I wish I could.
I just want to add one more thing. We installed Karzai as the puppet caretaker of that place. And who was Karzai before that? He was on the directorship of Unocal, the oil company from California. So it's ridiculous.
My question is sort of similar to the question that first question from the audience was but I tried to pose it a little bit more focused, and it's directed toward John. You kept repeating the word transnational, and I just wonder what that means, because I think
they work across national borders.
Okay, but I think it's a good Marxist, like the German political scientist Georg Fröber said that a good Marxist always looks into the newspaper. So we do have to deal with whatever is going on now, and not with categories that might have been true in the 19th century. So I guess we all appreciate that. But that being said, I'm not sure if that transnationalism does exist, or at least it was an idea, this kind of hard negri idea of empire that I think in 2008 just turned out to be false. When you look at, and I looked at the German discourse in the media, it was a highly nationalist discourse. There wasn't that much of unity in the interests of the EU, although they're trying to formulate a new hegemonic bloc. And NATO has NATO members have varying interests, as have G8 members. So I wonder how transnational things actually are.
Well, I mean, didn't NATO go and bomb Libya? I mean, that's transnational, isn't it?
But that was actually mostly driven by France. So there was
Well,
arguments.
well,
So
it doesn't
Germany was
matter.
against that.
Yes, I
Germany was a member of
understand that.
NATO.
They have, the goal is the same, but they differ on strategies. The same thing going into Iraq. France didn't want to, and Germany didn't want to. But what did they do about it? They just said, well, we're not going to take part in this, but you guys can do it anyway. It's a dirty word.
Yeah, freedom fries.
Freedom fries and all that other stuff, yeah, sure. The transnational elite, there was none before the 70s. Okay? When neoliberalization came into prominence, that's when you have transnational corporations and the elites who control those. So it was representative democracy and the market economy that actually created these, because they gave credence to transnational corporations. And who runs them? But transnational elites. I mean, I don't know what you're getting at here. If it's transnational is not a good term anymore, or it never existed. I mean, it didn't exist before the 70s, and no one ever brought that into the lexicon. Transnational elites.
Does anyone else have a comment, or should we move on?
Okay, this question is both for Bernard and John. Bernard, you mentioned that you didn't think that NATO or the G8 were proper objects of critique, and I agree, they are like lame objects of critique. And John, you used this term you're part of an anti-systemic project, so I assume that your object of critique is the system, which I would argue that that's also kind of lame-ish, like object of critique. I'm just wondering, why not capitalism? Why isn't capitalism your object of critique, or do you think it should be an object of critique?
Well, we have to make a distinction between the market economy, or globalized, the market economy, and capitalism. The market economy is a growth economy, and the best way to accumulate wealth in that is through capitalism. It's the capitalists who have the factories and do this and do that accumulates the wealth for the growth economy, which is the market economy.
So, why use the term the system? I'm still not sure.
The system is the market economy and representative democracy. That's what we call the system, because that system is a hierarchical order which concentrates power at the top, the 1%, if you like. And that's a lame term too, if you use that. Because actually, the 1% does have more accumulated wealth than the bottom 99%. But also, the 99% to the 90%, they also have more accumulated wealth than everybody below that. So maybe it could say we're the 89% or something like that.
So is your group specifically rejecting the idea that, like, there's, like, that, I don't really understand what you're talking
Oh,
about.
you know, we have some handouts. Did you get them?
No, I didn't.
There's a couple of handouts there, a short, brief introduction, and our aims, which gives us the theoretical aspect. They're over there. I don't know if everyone received them.
What is the proper object of critique? Well, that's a great question. I think that, and when you say, should capitalism be the object of critique, I think the problem with that question is that the definition, that the object, capitalism, is well, in the very defining of the object that you would be formulating your critique of, you've already got some critique going on. Okay? So, what I would suggest is a good object of critique would be the myth that there can be, or the talk of, or the discourse of, or the way people talk about the idea that there could be an economic, a form of organization that does not require governmentality, that does not require governance, that doesn't require kind of a governing of that system itself. Okay? So that's the idea of the free market, right? The idea that you could have a space, a space of economic exchange that is in fact not regulated. Okay, I think that, I would say that is an object, that is what I consider to be a good object of critique. And the object itself is the discourse about that, the fact that people speak as if there were such an object, right? I view that as a good object of critique. I hope that's, I don't know if that kind of gets to the question at least.
I'm Brian Worley. I'm a member of the Platypus affiliated society. And the call for the G8 NATO protest emanating from Occupy stems from their understanding that the institutions of NATO and G8 are undemocratic since the delegates are not elected directly from the people, but are delegated from governments or are the heads of states themselves. And this stems from their conception of direct democracy, which seems to me to be rooted in the Athenian polis. But this also ignores another genealogy of democracy that comes out of the Enlightenment from figures like Constantin Sayes, that sees the need for representation and levels of mediation in politics to both protect and promote democracy. So I wanted to ask the panelists what you think of the concept of democracy that is underlying the call for these protests against G8 and NATO.
I'll start, if that's okay. So yeah, that's very interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. So clearly there haven't been clearly the people who are representing the countries that form the G8 have not been chosen through any kind of general assembly, right? A model or any kind of the kind of grassroots democratic General Assembly model that is associated with the Occupy movement. They are the democratically elected, for the most part, representatives, as is President Obama, who will be hosting it and who will be the American representative at the G8, right? But it seems, so I hadn't thought of that kind of critique. But it raises a problem, I think, which has to do with representability, even within the Occupy movement itself. And so, so for instance, I noticed on the agenda here, I noticed that some people are identified in the parenthesis as being Occupy Chicago. And someone's identified as being formerly Occupy Chicago. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that you could have someone representing the United States, or for that matter, Occupy Chicago, on a model of General Assembly to engage in conversations with other countries, or for that matter, with other Occupy movements. In other words, I think if you really take that notion of democracy seriously, I'm not sure that there's any delegation possible. So it's not clear to me actually that the critique works in some sense, because it almost undermines the very idea that you could elect someone to then represent either Occupy Chicago or Occupy Los Angeles or the United States or France, to then engage in some kind of conversation that would have any ability to be anything more than something that's not actually a conversation that's legitimately taking place. I don't know, it's complicated.
Yes, it is, very much so. I think we have to pick up on what you said about delegation. In a democracy, there are no representatives, like we have in representative democracy, where you give your power of decisions to someone you don't even know, who, of course, makes decisions we know in Congress and even on the local level, makes decisions based on who their friends are or who puts them in office or where the money's coming from, controlling budgets, etc. However, in a direct democracy or a real democracy, you can have delegation, which means that if we've confederalized several local democracies to work together to share resources, etc., and to compile basic needs, if the local democracy makes a decision on, well, you know, we need a certain amount of denim to make jeans for our community, okay? But we need to go at a confederal level to make sure that these come through, that the denim gets here. Power is, I wouldn't say that, but a person is delegated to carry out that policy. You see? So the decision is made on the local level, and the delegate has to make sure that that policy gets put through at the confederal level so that these people can get their denim. If they don't, then they're immediately recalled. So there's really no elections or anybody elected or anything like that. The elite, I don't we want to use that term anymore. Well, Wolfowitz was the head of the Pentagon, and then where did he go after that? The World Bank. So, you know, and they just agreed to it. Yeah, we'll let Paul over there because he'll help us out soon. And again, the elite appointed a technocrat, an expert, to become the prime minister of Greece and Italy. So there's no really, they don't elect anybody. They just appoint people to do these things.
I'd like to clarify what you guys think about trade. From what I've seen, whenever markets are open up and trade occurs, foreign direct investment increases, and ultimately the standard of living increases among the populace. And we've seen this in China and India. So I'm wondering what, if any, opposition you have to free trade and deregulation. Can you clarify that?
It's a myth. I mean, people in China are probably worse off than they were under Mao. So this deregulation and the free movement of capital and goods across barriers and all that deregulation only helps to keep the people in power in their place intact, and it keeps the hierarchy intact. It has nothing to do with really people's needs or anything like that. They could care less about what they do. There's more sweatshops in China than anywhere in the world.
Well, I mean, you know, we have a free market, so international trade includes to me things like French companies coming over here and building private prisons. You know, that's, I don't think it has anything to do with human freedom at all. I mean, the one unconscionable freedom of free trade. You know, it's not something that I have any positive opinion of. I mean, unless it's, you know, unless you want to counterpose it to like fascist control of trade, you know. But those are relative things, I think.
Just to follow up on that, I'm wondering from your perspective, Fred, would you see a distinction between free trade under current auspices and some kind of alternative global economic integration? How does that distinction function for you?
Well, I mean, the alternative is, yeah, free association is the alternative. I mean, and that would be genuine freedom, which would begin at the point of production itself, where workers would decide what they produce, when they produce it, how they produce it, and you know, freely enter into agreements with people, and I mean, across national borders. I mean, presumably national borders would be pretty moved at that point, you know, if you got to that point of revolution. But you know, the alternative to capitalism is freedom. I mean, It's free association capitalism is oppressive in its very nature. It begins by oppressing the worker at the point of production. It blows up into great crises that oppress us all with war, with absolute environmental degradation that we're seeing. I mean, there's like nothing that can be said about it in terms of it enhancing human freedom at this point in history. It just doesn't.
My question is for Bernard. And a little while ago, you said that the object of critique should not be capitalism, but it should be neoliberal ideology or the ideology of free markets. And that's why something like G8, or if I understood you correctly, that's why something like G8 would be a proper object of critique. What worries me about something like that is that the idea that it's precisely the neoliberal ideology that should be critiqued potentially shows a nostalgia for Fordist capitalism, for the capitalism of the mid-20th century. And as we well know, that was not at all an emancipatory form of social life. Highly regulated markets and the kind of states, kind of administrative states that existed at that time were not superior to what we have now in any way. So I'm wondering if the critique of neoliberalism is from the standpoint of the regulated markets of the 20th century and of the Fordist state of the 20th century, or if it is from another standpoint. I mean, the advantage that a Marxist critique of capitalism has is that it encapsulates both of those. And that is why I would, prefer capitalism as an object of critique of more than neoliberalism or free market ideology.
Incidentally, I would just add that a local group in Chicago that claims to support a New Deal is also among the supporters of the coalition against G8 and NATO. So this is a live political issue as well.
Yeah. Okay. So no, this is great. And here's what I mean. Here's what I meant when I said capitalism is not a good object of critique. It's just that I think you need more specificity as to exactly what you are describing. Okay, so I just think that the term capitalism is too vague. Okay, so you could possibly then turn to a specific practice that you have in mind. But there are so many different ways in which people describe capitalism itself, whether it's crony capitalism or late modern capitalism or what stage we're at, etc. That just the term itself, like is not, it seems to me, an adequate. It's not specific enough to be a target of critique. Now, so if you want to define so that's why when I'm proposing kind of the what I was looking at was something that I think is very specific, right? It's very specific. In this case it's the idea that you could say have a space that is not regulated. Okay, so that's okay. Now, but I wouldn't say that's not. I don't think that's necessarily kind of neoliberalism. Again, neoliberalism would be too big a term. I think. I mean, I'm specifically saying the idea that you could have a space that's not regulated. Okay, I think that's an object of critique. Right? Now, but neoliberalism itself, I think, is already too big a category because there's so many different ways of interpreting the concept of neoliberalism itself, and in the same way as capitalism, right? So is there such a thing as even privatization is a problematic thing because it's not clear exactly what we're referring to, if there is such a thing, right? Or if it's a transfer of wealth or something like that. So what I'm suggesting is not so much, what I'm suggesting is that the object needs to be exactly specified, okay? And I wouldn't want to use a large rubric, okay? You know, yeah.
Okay, just a follow-up question
Yeah,
really quick.
yeah.
But isn't defining that very, very specific object as free market ideology, which is
Idea.
more or less what you described,
yeah.
doesn't that make the standpoint of the critique a kind of administered New Deal type kind of state capitalism?
Response. Or no, that the response is a...
Yeah,
an
the
attraction
perspective from which you would be holding that criticism.
Okay, no, so, all right, well, I mean, it depends on the critique that you make to a certain extent, right? But, I mean, the critique that I make is that doesn't exist. The notion of a space that is unregulated doesn't exist, okay? Okay. Now, that means that also the notion of a space that is overregulated doesn't exist either. So, in other words, it's a critique not only of the idea that there could be a free market, right? It's also a critique of the idea that, you know, regulation is going to solve the problems, right? It's addressed to both sides in some sense. It's a nominalist critique in the sense that it's about the way in which we categorize economic spaces, right? Okay, and the argument is that there is no such thing as a space that is not regulated, and there is no such thing as a space that is regulated. There are nothing but forms of regulation, which goes back a little bit to the earlier question about deregulation, when someone was mentioning kind of the possibility of deregulation, right? I mean, what follows from that critique is that actually there is no such thing as deregulation. There's re-regulation, right? But the spaces that you tend to think of, whether it's in China or elsewhere, that we think of as being kind of deregulated space are not. There is no such a thing as a deregulated space. It's an entirely re-regulated space. And I take it that once you've done that critique, then the important question is to figure out how all of the regulatory mechanisms work to funnel money to a particular elite, say, or a particular segment of society, right? But so, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak for a second to the question of like the specific object of critique, because one of the advantages that Marxism has is that it's very specific in its object of critique, to the point where if you look at chapter 1 of Capital, Marx writes about the commodity form. That commodity form includes all the contradictions of capitalism within it, including even a return to primitive accumulation, including the degradation of the environment, genocide, war. Everything is included within the critique of that commodity form and its abolition and freely associated labor. And I think that's as specific as you can possibly get. I don't think there's another economic writer that's ever lived that's come remotely close to that specificity of the object of critique that Marx did. And I wanted to make that point since we're discussing it.
And just to follow up, so if you want to say, for instance, that the commodity form, as expressed in certain practices, in certain economic practices, I think, yeah, that would be a very specific object of critique, right?
We have time for probably one more question. I saw your hand. Actually, maybe we can take both of them. I saw both of you. So go ahead.
I want to say, as an organizer of the, I think it was, the first G8, G20 protest in Seattle, two or 3 years before the now famous G8 protest, we saw the G8 as an opportunity to explain the despotic rule of capital at the point of production, that the G8 was this body that's not accountable to anyone, whose only purpose is to maintain the profitability of capital, and that rule of the law of profit controls just about every aspect of our social life, from government to our daily activities. I wanted to also bring together the two panels that have been happening here, and historically, that may And Chicago had, well, first May Day obviously in Chicago has a historic reference, but the first May Day strike, from which May Day is known for, began at McCormick Place in Chicago, the general strike. The first place to general strike in Chicago was McCormick Place, where the NATO summit is being held. Just food for thought.
I sort of disagree with the idea of specificity, except as it was expressed by Fred, because the thing that it reminded me of more than anything else was when that guy got beaten up and some neighbor did the video, and then they put the police on trial in California in the Rodney King beating. Okay, that's what I was trying to think of. And the way these guys got off was that they took the video and isolated each frame and made every movement specific. And when you did that, Rodney King didn't get beaten up. It was the overall fact that he had been beaten up that was completely lost in the specificity. And so this is just an analogy. So it probably doesn't actually apply, except if you get too specific, you're just gonna miss it. And at least in that case. And then I had a trivial question. My trivial question was when we saw that bar graph of the per capita expenditure of defense spending in the U.S. and then the bar graph of the per capita defense spending in Saudi Arabia. We sell a lot of our stuff to Saudi. I don't know whether we sell a lot of it, but Saudi Arabia gets a great deal of their stuff from us. And I'm wondering if if the part that we sold to Saudi Arabia was subtracted from our defense spending because we sold it to them and made a profit on it, and so that we should subtract that from our total. And if it is such a small amount that it doesn't really matter.
It's too specific.
I mean, that graph confused me because Saudi Arabia gets all their stuff from us, and we sell it to them at a profit. And are we including?
I don't think the government gets a cut of that.
You don't think what?
The government gets a cut of that. The corporations sell it directly to them.
Right, so the defense spending is US dollars that go mostly to defense contractors and to pay for military and et cetera, right?
Okay.
And then the Saudi defense spending would also be Saudi government money going to probably, mostly perhaps, yes, American defense contractors. So
Yeah, okay.
what I didn't
Yeah,
have was a
that's
bar graph. Maybe what I need is a bar graph for revenue from military contractors throughout the world. And then-
Actually, to a question, I think rather than subtracting, you should add.
Right.
All of the Saudi Arabia should be added to the American. Now you have a more realistic appraisal of what are we talking about.
Yeah.
It's a bigger number, huge.
So before we wrap up, Watson was jumping a bit, so what
yeah.
on this?
Isn't the idea of an unregulated space just liberalism in the sense that the society is not completely determined by the system, by the government? Isn't that what you're making the object you're taking, saying that no, there's no liberalism, there's no space that's free from regulation?
Well, it's economic liberalism, or it's the tradition of liberalism that is embodied by 18th century economists to Friedman, etc.
As we saw in the healthcare debate, is there any area of life that can't be rendered economic? Don't we need a broader definition? I think a person is isn't undermining the idea of no regulation, also sort of undermining the idea of freedom and autonomy as counterpoint to that?
Well, I'll just cut in here because we have a few issues on the table here. Liberalism, freedom, autonomy, specificity of the object of critique, and also the comment about despotism at the point of production being one of the motivations for summit protests in general. So I think those are some nice issues to close on. If you want to each give some closing remarks in the order that we started.
What was those? Liberalism? the other things you said there.
Yes, liberalism specifying the object of critique, and the idea of despotism at the point of production motivating some
The spot plan capitalism.
Well, there's a lot of suppression in this country at the level of our daily lives, whether it's in the workplace or on the streets. Liberalism, that's just a way of accommodating the system. Most liberals, Barack Obama would call himself a liberal. So it's a certain way of accommodating the status quo. Liberalism, I don't think, did anything, really. And the other thing is specification. Yeah, sometimes, if you're a scientist, you work with a microscope, you go dig so far down, you just are looking at minute things, and sometimes you can forget how it's connected to the whole sometimes. And we shouldn't forget that, even though we should be very conscious that we have to be very specific about what we talk about, I think, because people say what they don't mean and mean what they don't say. So we have to be very careful with that in terms of specification.
I think, it's been a great panel, but we've just begun barely to scratch the surface of some of these issues. And, this question of specificity, it brings up things like the specifics of American history, and things like Barack Obama as the first black president, and at the same time as the man presiding over the system. And I think that the left is so far from dealing with that contradiction that it's amazing to me. And I think the one other thing, and there's no time to go into that, the one other thing I want to mention is there was a question asked, if Occupy adopts the alter-globalization model of summit hopping, would that be a regression? And I think it would be a regression in a certain sense. The reason that the state made a point of getting rid of all the General Assembly spaces, the public spaces that were occupied, that were seized, was because there was an actual democratic consciousness developing there. And it's the last thing we want to see. And the important thing about those spaces were really their own, like what Marx said about the Paris Commune, although it wasn't on that level, but it was its own working existence was the important thing about it, the practice of democracy. And while that is where, revolutionary ideas can find a place, because it's that experience of radical democracy that gives birth to revolutionary ideas in the first place. Whether you're talking about Hegel's reflections on the French Revolution, or Marx's relationship to revolution, or his rewriting of Capital to take into account the experience of the Paris Commune in Chapter 1 as the model for free association that smashes the commodity form. That kind of radical democracy, and to lose that space, and at the same time, I think it will be retrogression if revolutionaries don't enter into that discussion and join it and put our ideas out there as a part of that dialogue. I think we can't, I love some of my Occupy friends, but this idea that you can't name capitalism is a disastrous one that, just won't go anywhere.
So I'll just finish on this last question of liberalism and freedom. So what I would say is that I think that there has been that the notion of liberalism tried to co-opt or seize an idea of freedom in the economic sphere as being something about political freedom, and that what's actually really interesting is if you look back to the text from the 18th century, that notion of economic freedom, which was conceived of as political freedom, but it was essentially economic freedom, went hand in hand with a strong police state. And so if you look at, for instance, the physiocrats, who were precursors to a liberal economic notion, and who believed in natural order, right? Their notion of natural orderliness in the economic sphere was tied hand in hand with a philosophy of legal despotism. That was the term, actually, legal despotism. And the notion of legal despotism was that you don't need a state to engage in economic regulation, you just need a state to deal with those people who are disorderly. And in some sense, who don't understand that there's orderliness in the economic sphere, right? And that parallel, that kind of notion has been joined at the hip throughout, I would say, the history of liberalism and in neoliberalism today, that it's always a notion of freedom in the economic domain, but tied and joined at the hip with the notion of the legitimate space of government intervention being policing, or military, international or domestic. And it's not surprising, and in fact I think there's a deep connection in terms of a facilitating connection between the fact that when it was during a period of neoliberalism that we saw mass incarceration arise in the United States, right, which began in 1973 and has reached a point where there is approximately 1% of the adult population behind bars. Those things have been tied since the 18th century, I believe. A notion of freedom, but a need for the state to function as a legitimate policing function. And so, does that mean that when one does the critique that one loses freedom? No, I don't think so. I think that you just have to have a different conception of what freedom is. I mean, I think that it has been, yes, you lose that 18th century notion of freedom, but that 18th century notion of freedom, I think, was an illusion. And it was tied to a large policing state, back then and still today.
Great, well, I want to thank you all for your questions, and let's give a round of applause for that.
Don't forget, if you want some reading information, on that table, that's right here.